Jamaica, 1730. The mist rolls through the dense forests of the Blue Mountains, carrying with it the faint echo of a conch shell, a sound forbidden by the British, yet feared by every soldier who heard it. It was not just a call. It was a declaration. Deep within those emerald shadows, a woman stood with fire in her eyes and a spirit unbroken. Her name was Nanny, the woman who turned the forest into a fortress, the mountains into her army, and pain into the immortal cry for freedom. In the early 18th century, Jamaica glittered like a jewel in the British Empire's crown, but its shine was born from blood. The sugar plantations stretched endlessly under the blazing Caribbean sun, where thousands of African men and women toiled until their backs broke, their names forgotten, their songs drowned by the crack of the whip. The island was said to produce sweetness for Europe, yet for those who worked its soil, Jamaica was a furnace of suffering. Ships arrived from the African coast, carrying human cargo shackled in irons, their bodies starved and their spirits splintered. Many did not survive the Middle Passage. Those who did faced a new kind of death, one that wore the face of labor, hunger, and despair. But not all chains could hold. Some escaped into the mountains, into the deep green lungs of the island, where the British dared not go. They called themselves Maroons, from the Spanish cimarron, meaning wild or untamed. Hidden in the misty folds of the Blue Mountains, they built new lives, small, fiercely independent communities that lived off the land, hunted in silence, and moved like shadows. They were the whisper the colonizers could not silence. Out of this rebellion of survival rose a woman whose name would one day become legend, Nanny. No one truly knew where she came from. Some said she was born in Africa, of the Ashanti people, taken in chains to Jamaica. Others believed she was born on the island, carrying the memory of freedom in her blood. What was certain is that she carried within her the wisdom of the old world, songs of ancestors, knowledge of herbs, and the courage that comes only from loss. While the British governed with rifles and fear, Nanny governed with understanding. She listened to her people's pain and turned it into resolve. Her presence was quiet but commanding, her gaze steady, as if she could already see the cracks forming in the empire's walls. In a world that treated black women as invisible, Nanny became the eyes of the forest and the heart of a revolution. She gathered the scattered, healed the wounded, and began to teach them the art of endurance and, when the time came, the art of war. The island might have been bound in chains, but deep within its heart, freedom was beginning to breathe again. They said Nanny could hear the forest breathe. When others only heard the rustle of leaves, she heard the whispers of ancestors and the warnings of the wind. The Blue Mountains became her ally, and she learned to move through them as though the trees themselves guided her steps. Every sound had meaning. The distant cry of a bird signaled danger. The crack of a branch told her where the soldiers were coming from. Nanny taught her followers to read the forest as one reads a sacred text, each leaf, each echo, a message of survival. Her camp became both sanctuary and school. At night, beneath the moonlight filtering through the canopy, she gathered the people around the fire. There, she spoke not of vengeance, but of freedom, of what it would feel like to wake one morning and no longer fear the whip or the chain. She taught them to use conch shells to communicate across vast distances. One sharp blow meant gather, two meant retreat. The British heard only strange jungle noises, but for the Maroons, it was the heartbeat of unity. Nanny was more than a leader. She was a healer and a prophetess. Her hands could mend wounds made by musket balls, and her words could lift spirits crushed by grief. Mothers came to her for remedies, warriors for guidance, and all left with renewed strength. In her presence, the forest itself seemed to shift. Smoke from the fires rose like offerings to the sky, and the drums beat softly, echoing the pulse of distant Africa. When she looked into the mist, she saw more than trees. She saw an army waiting to awaken, and soon, that army would rise. By 1728, the British could no longer ignore the growing threat in the mountains. Reports flooded into Kingston of plantations burned, crops stolen, and overseers vanishing into the night. The name Nanny Town was whispered with fear among soldiers who had once believed the Maroons were only scattered fugitives. The colonial governor declared the Maroons a danger to the crown and dispatched troops into the Blue Mountains to crush them. But the soldiers did not know what awaited them. They marched in bright red coats, their drums echoing through the valleys, loud, confident, foreign. They were trained to fight in open fields, to form lines and fire volleys. Yet the mountains of Jamaica had no mercy for such order. Every step was a trap. Every shadow hid eyes. Nanny watched them from above, her people silent and waiting. The forest around them was thick with humidity, the air electric with tension. When the British stopped to rest, arrows rained from unseen perches. When they advanced, the ground beneath them gave way to hidden pits and bamboo spikes. The soldiers' polished boots became their own prison as mud clung and dragged them down. The British called it witchcraft. They said the woman leading these wild tribes could vanish into smoke, that bullets curved away from her. But the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. Nanny knew the land. She knew the streams that whispered secrets and the roots that could trip a man to his death. She turned every stone, every tree, every misty dawn into an accomplice. Her people moved with precision. They struck, disappeared, and reappeared miles away. The British called it chaos. Nanny called it patience. The mountains had taught her that time was the greatest weapon, and she wielded it with elegance. As weeks turned into months, the British began to break. They feared the forest as much as they feared her, and as she watched them retreat into the lowlands, Nanny whispered to the wind, "Freedom has no master." The battles that followed became legend. Nanny transformed her fighters into ghosts of the jungle, unseen, unheard, unstoppable. Under her command, small bands of Maroons would descend on isolated outposts, strike with fury, and melt back into the mist. Their bodies bore scars, but their spirits were unbroken. Each attack was planned with precision. Nanny's strategies were built on rhythm, like the beats of a drum. She studied the British, their routines, their arrogance, their fear of the dark. She taught her warriors to move as silently as wind through leaves, to fight not for glory but for memory for those who had died nameless in the cane fields. To outsiders, the Maroon resistance seemed impossible. How could a group of fugitives defy one of the most powerful empires on earth? But Nanny had something the British did not: purpose. While their soldiers fought for orders, her people fought for the right to exist. Legends began to spread among both Maroons and colonists. Some swore they saw Nanny catch bullets with her bare hands, or make musket balls vanish in mid-air. Others claimed her power came from Obeah, the ancestral spiritual practice she carried from Africa, an invisible shield of faith and defiance. But behind every myth lay a truth. Her real weapon was not magic, but unity. She turned fear into discipline, grief into strategy. When her warriors faltered, she reminded them that every fallen brother or sister was a root in the soil, and from that root, freedom would grow. Under the cloak of night, the sound of the conch shell echoed once more. It was the same call that had begun in the mist years before, now louder, stronger, carried by 1,000 hearts. The British called it rebellion. Nanny called it awakening. High in the Blue Mountains stood a place both feared and sacred, Nanny Town. Hidden by dense mist and guarded by sheer cliffs. It was more than a settlement, it was a symbol. Every path leading to it twisted through ravines and rivers that only the Maroons could cross. The British maps showed nothing. To them, Nanny Town was a ghost. But to the people who lived there, it was the beating heart of freedom. From this mountain stronghold, Nanny ruled not with cruelty, but with respect. Each morning, the smell of roasting breadfruit and plantains filled the air as smoke rose gently through the trees. Children fetched water from the streams, women tended to the crops. Men trained with bows and muskets taken from fallen enemies. The village was alive with the rhythm of resistance. Nanny believed that a people could not fight for freedom if they could not first feed themselves. She taught them to farm on the steep slopes, yams, bananas, cassava, anything that could grow under the mountain's blessing. Goats grazed on narrow ridges, while smokehouses cured meat for the next journey into war. Her council of elders gathered under a large silk cotton tree, where plans were made in whispers and silence. Every raid was a symphony of timing. Messengers carried orders through the forest using coded drum beats. From Nanny Town came the warriors who burned plantations, freed captives, and brought back the stolen not gold, but people. To the British, Nanny Town became a nightmare. Soldiers who tried to climb its slopes vanished into the mist. They would return days later, half-starved, speaking of unseen eyes and haunting drums that echoed through the night. They began to call it the Devil's Nest. But to the Maroons, it was Mother Nanny's land, a sanctuary born of defiance. As her fighters returned from each mission, they laid their weapons at her feet not as trophies, but as offerings. She reminded them that every victory was temporary, every loss a lesson. In the quiet moments, she walked to the edge of the cliffs and looked down at the island below. Somewhere in the distance, the plantations still burned, but above them, the air was free. And as dawn painted the forest gold, Nanny's silhouette stood firm against the rising sun, a woman who had carved freedom into the mountain itself. Frustrated and humiliated, the British resorted to cruelty. They offered rewards, gold, land, even pardon to anyone who could capture Nanny dead or alive. They spread rumors that she had been killed, that her people had scattered, hoping fear would do what bullets could not. But no one dared betray her. The forest itself seemed to protect her. Those who tried never returned. Some were found days later, lifeless at the foot of ravines. Others simply vanished, swallowed by the same mist they had sought to penetrate. Among the soldiers who survived the mountain patrols, stories began to spread. They said Nanny's warriors could appear from nowhere, that her eyes glowed in the dark, and that the wind carried her voice through the trees. One British officer, trembling after his escape, told his superiors, "We are not fighting people, we are fighting the forest, and the forest belongs to her." The governor, desperate, sent larger armies, burning entire villages suspected of helping the Maroons. But each time he struck, Nanny's resistance only grew stronger. She refused to meet cruelty with cruelty. Her warfare was disciplined, deliberate. She reminded her people, "We do not fight for revenge, we fight to make the world remember that we are human." Still, the toll was heavy. Food grew scarce. The wounded increased. The mountain streams ran red after each ambush. Yet even as exhaustion spread, Nanny's voice never faltered. She gathered her people around the fires and spoke softly. "The chains that once bound us have melted into the earth. The British cannot take what we have already reclaimed, our spirits." In the eyes of her followers, she was no longer just a leader. She had become a myth made flesh, a woman who stood between life and legend. The British called her a rebel. Her people called her mother. And in that dark hour, as the empire loomed larger, Nanny prepared for her greatest victory, not through death or destruction, but through endurance. By the late 1730s, the war that had raged through Jamaica's mountains began to wear even the British thin. The cost was staggering, soldiers lost, supply lines broken, morale shattered. No matter how many expeditions they sent, Nanny and her people seemed to multiply in the mist. Every defeat echoed across the Atlantic like a bruise on the empire's pride. Finally, in 1739, exhaustion forced the British to speak words they had never before uttered to an African people: peace. They sent envoys under white flags into the mountains. Escorted by trembling soldiers, they sought not surrender, but negotiation. For the first time, the empire would sit at the same table as those it had enslaved. When Nanny emerged to meet them, silence fell. She stood wrapped in a red cloth, her hair braided like a crown, her eyes calm yet piercing. The British officer in charge, unused to bowing his head, found himself lowering his gaze. Between them lay a treaty, simple words on fragile paper that would change history. The Maroon Treaty of 1739 recognized the freedom of Nanny's people. It granted them the right to live in the mountains, to own their land, and to govern themselves. No longer would they be hunted or enslaved. It was the first legal acknowledgement of freedom for Africans in the New World, a crack in the iron wall of slavery. Yet Nanny's signature was not an act of submission, it was an act of wisdom. She understood that peace was another form of warfare, one that required patience instead of blades. The treaty demanded that the Maroons not harbor future runaways, a bitter clause that weighed on her conscience. But Nanny knew survival was the foundation of all resistance. To live free, even imperfectly, was to keep the flame alive for others still in chains. When she returned to Nanny Town, her people greeted her with drums and tears. For the first time, the conch shell that once called them to battle now called them to celebration. Smoke rose through the valleys, not from burning fields, but from fires of thanksgiving. And in that night of song and rhythm, Nanny looked to the sky, knowing that true freedom was still far from complete, but that the world had changed. From that mountain, the impossible had been achieved. A woman, once enslaved, had forced an empire to kneel. Long after the battles ended, the name Nanny began to take root, not only in the mountains, but in the hearts of all Jamaicans. She was no longer just the Maroon leader. She became a symbol of endurance, of womanhood, of a fire that could not be extinguished. In a world ruled by men and empires, Nanny redefined what power looked like. Her strength was not born of muscle or weapons, but of compassion sharpened into courage. She healed as fiercely as she fought. She led not through orders, but through example. Women gathered around her to learn how to fight, how to defend their homes, how to believe that their hands, too, could shape destiny. To them, Nanny was more than human. She was Mama Nanny, the mother of the Maroons. Her teachings were passed through generations like sacred scripture. She taught that freedom must be protected not only with spears, but with wisdom, unity, and care. The same hands that pulled arrows from wounds also planted seeds in the soil. Her influence stretched beyond her lifetime. Among her descendants were warriors, midwives, and singers who carried her name like armor. They said that when the wind rustles the banana leaves at night, it is Nanny's spirit walking through the forest, checking that her people remain free. Even British chroniclers, who once branded her a savage sorceress, began to speak of her with reluctant respect. She had defeated them without ever leaving her mountains. The myth of her bullet-catching hands lived on not as superstition, but as metaphor. She caught the violence of empire and transformed it into the endurance of her people. And for the women of Jamaica, enslaved, silenced, forgotten, her story became a hymn. They whispered her name when giving birth, when hiding from overseers, when daring to dream of rebellion. Nanny became proof that a woman's will could carve paths through iron and smoke. Generations later, when Jamaica stood on the edge of independence, they would look back and see her not just as a fighter, but as the first heartbeat of freedom. No one knows how Nanny's story truly ended. The British claimed she was shot during an ambush, her body left somewhere in the ravines below Nanny Town. Others whispered that she did not die at all, that she simply walked into the mountains, one misty dawn, and became one with them. Her people refused to mourn. "How can you bury the wind?" they said. "How can you kill the forest?" What history lost in certainty, legend preserved in faith. For decades after her disappearance, soldiers who entered the Blue Mountains swore they could still hear her conch shell echoing through the valleys. Farmers said that whenever the drums sounded during storms, Nanny was reminding the living to stay strong. Her village endured, rebuilt again and again after each British assault, until the land itself seemed to guard its secrets. Travelers who reached its ruins centuries later found fragments of pottery, musket balls, and the faint trace of terraces carved for planting silent witnesses to the life she had built in defiance of empire. In the centuries that followed, Jamaica changed hands. Revolutions came and went, and new nations were born, but Nanny's name never faded. In the songs of the Maroons, she remained the guardian of the hills, the protector of the free. She was no longer just a person, she was memory incarnate, the embodiment of a people's refusal to be erased. When Jamaica became independent in 1962, the nation searched for figures who represented its soul. Out of hundreds of heroes, 7 were chosen to stand eternal, and among them, only one was a woman. Her name was Nanny of the Maroons. Her face now lives on the $500 Jamaican note, her eyes calm but unyielding. The same gaze that once watched over the forest now looks upon her people still. She is there in classrooms where history is retold, in the voices of women who lead, and in the rhythm of the drums that still echo through the hills. No stone marks her grave, yet every root in the mountain remembers her. The empire that once hunted her is gone. Her legend remains alive in the soil, in the wind, and in every heart that believes freedom can be born from pain. Centuries later, the story of Nanny is not only the story of one woman's defiance, it is the story of what freedom costs. She did not fight to destroy, she fought to remind her people of who they were before chains. She turned forests into classrooms, grief into strength, and silence into thunder. When Jamaica gained its independence, the sound of the conch shell was heard once more, not as a war cry, but as a hymn. It carried through the valleys like a heartbeat, echoing across time. For the Maroons, that sound means the same thing it did in 1730. We are still here. Nanny's legacy is not measured in battles won, but in dignity restored. She taught that power can be quiet, that leadership can wear the face of a mother, and that the memory of pain can become the seed of freedom. Today, her spirit still moves through the Blue Mountains in the mist that hides the dawn, in the rustle of the leaves, in the breath of the land she once defended. And if you listen closely, you might still hear it, the distant call of the conch, summoning every forgotten soul to rise. Because freedom, once awakened, never sleeps again.